It is the Sengoku Jidai. Besieged and surrounded by his enemies, a lord pays a group of men to see his only child to safety. But do they have the skill to ensure her safety? And can they even be trusted? For this is an age of honor and treachery, of blood and valor, of gold and steel. Now available at Amazon, Smashwords, and at studiobrainstorm.net. Links in the description. So, we are here. Vindication, a 4-part story arc whose last issue was released in November of 2008, nearly 3 years after the very first issue was released back in January of 2006. KOTOR the comic having a monthly serialization. From the very beginning, Miller had been carefully guiding the storyline of this comic, adding information here, teasing certain subplots there. Now we reach the culmination. Even though there's 15 more chapters that come after this, Vindication very much has the feel of a climactic finale. If not a series finale, at the very least a season finale. 2 things to consider before we get this party started. First, between Vindication and Exalted, there is a single issue story called Turnabout. It's usually lumped in with Exalted in any omnibus collection, but because I feel it ties in far more to Vindication, I've decided to include it in this video. For Turnabout, Brian Ching and Michael Attia did the cover art, while the interiors were done by guest artist Alan Robinson. Second, with regards to Vindication proper, we unfortunately must abandon any hope of artistic consistency. For whatever reason, I haven't been able to find exactly why, Brian Ching was not available to do the art for all 4. He does the interiors for issues 1, 3, and 4, while Bong Dazo was brought in to do the interiors for issue 2. Ching did the cover art for issues 1 through 3, while the 4th and final cover art was done by Dan Scott. Still, the inconsistency is a small price to pay to have the best artist in this series back in the chair. Alright, enough preamble, let's begin. Alas, I must begin this retrospective on a negative note, because within a few pages, it's clear to see that Alan Robinson is very much in the running with Scott Hepburn for worst artist in this series. I think the only thing that keeps Scott Hepburn occupying the absolute worst spot is that at least Robinson has a sense of proportion when it comes to faces. He knows that women actually have chins, and men's faces are not 50% chin. At any rate, the story begins with Lucian Dre moving into his new quarters as a member of the High Council of the Jedi, and thinking that, by rights, it should be his father occupying a seat on the council instead of him. Barristan Dre, the brave and noble Jedi Knight killed by a bomb blast during the Sith War. It's a nice little reminder that Lucian Dre has not had the best upbringing. His father was dead, and his mother effectively neglected him just because he had no second sight of his own. Krinda didn't think that he was worthy of her time, and in a way, Lucian doesn't think he himself is worthy of his father's legacy. This doesn't make him likable by any means, he's had far too many douchebag moments for that, but it does add a few shades of gray to an otherwise very antagonistic man. We then move on to Masters Vandar Tokar and Vrook Lamar, patronizing, incognito, a seedy dive in one of the lower levels of Coruscant. Admittedly, I am stretching the definition of incognito a considerable amount, given that Master Vandar still has his own personal hover seat, and hooded robes kinda stand out. At any rate, the 2 masters are here for a relatively clandestine meeting, with Shell and Alec going under the alias Captain Malik. Bit of a foreshadowing moment there. Foreshadowing that's just about as obvious as the tattoos on his head. Malik did have a full head of hair once, but he lost it after being tortured by Demagol back in Flashpoint, and at this point it seems to be clear that his hair's not coming back. Master Vrook is none too pleased with having to deal with a Revankist, But the initial verbal jabbing between the two men does give us a little information about Alec. Remember how back when he was first introduced he was mostly known by the nickname Squint? Well, apparently on his homeworld of Quelii, they didn't have last names, so when he was inducted into the Jedi Order, the Republic's immigration office listed the name of his village as his surname. And trust me when I say, if my last name was anything like Squinquar Gessimus, I would take a nickname over that any day. As to why he's adopted the alias of Captain Malik, well, apparently the Jedi Order's hostility towards the Revankists has gotten to the point where they've now issued an arrest warrant for them and anyone who wants to join them. As such, being on Coruscant at all is a great risk for Alec. But he still owes Zane for saving him and the other Revankist back at Flashpoint, and arranging a meeting between Zane and the Masters is how he can repay that debt. We also learn from Shell that the main reason that Vrook and Vandar are even having this meeting is because Zane and company sent them a transmission including details of what happened on Jebel and the Sith artifact storehouse on Audran. Shell and Alec are here to help set up the meeting between the two Masters and Zane. They were able to get to Coruscant. The pertinent question now is whether or not Zane can. Lest we forget, Admiral Karath, on Lucien Dre's recommendation, has set up a cordon around Coruscant. If Zane wants to reveal what he knows about the Covenant to the Council, he's going to have to get past them first. Speaking of the, good Admiral, we join him and Master Zamar on the bridge of his new flagship, the Swiftsure. Apparently, Admiral Karath suffered a serious injury to his foot during the fracas aboard the Arcanian Legacy, as he's now sporting a cane and a prosthetic. Given that Zane was his former prisoner and slipped through his fingers back on the Arcanian Legacy, Karath is very much determined to either capture or kill the former Padawan. And this time, he's confident that he can manage it easily. How, you ask? Something that should bring more than a few wry smiles to any of you besides me who are familiar with the Thrawn trilogy. Karath calls it the Vangervalis chain. It's a system where all the ships in the fleet directly link to the Swiftshure's computer. That computer has received some post-Battle of Sirocco upgrades, namely a sensor package that allows it to predict the enemy's movement and adjust the entire fleet's positioning accordingly. In other words, good old slave circuitry. This video is going to be long enough as it is, so I'll save an explanation for that when I finally do the Thrawn trilogy. But suffice to say, anyone who's read those books knows this is going to be trouble down the line. While the Admiral shows off his new system, it's pretty clear that Zamar is still haunted by the prophecy of the Rogue Moon. After all, his vision showed him dying with the Republic fleet killed by friendly fire. At one point, when he expresses doubts about the wisdom of slaving all the ships together, he says the word prophecy, then catches himself and says prediction. Eventually, the Mumo Willowa arrives in system and is hailed by a picket fighter squadron. Fortunately for Zane and co., the leader of that squadron is Lieutenant Karth Onasi. Unfortunately, Onasi isn't just willing to let them fly by. Apparently, as penalty for letting Zane go back on the Arcanian Legacy, Onasi lost his position as a bridge officer, which is why he's now a wing commander. He does at least order his men to shoot to disable rather than kill, but that's of small comfort to our heroes. The situation isn't helped by the fact that Zane refuses to return lethal fire. In fairness, he is trying to prove himself innocent of a murder he didn't commit. Killing Republic fighter pilots who are only following orders isn't going to help his case. Take note of this scene in particular, folks, because it's going to become relevant later on in the series. The gambit has failed, human. We should do whatever we must to escape. I'm trying to prove I didn't kill innocent people, Roland. Doing it now isn't going to help. And since when do you care about saving your skin? The Roland I know would take any risk to find the truth, like we're doing now. Just file that little exchange away for later, is all I'm saying. Anyway, with the slave circuitry boosting the coordination of the Republic cruisers, Karath is confident that there's no way in hell Zane can slip past them and reach the planet's surface. Zamar is less sanguine. Zane has escaped the Covenant before, and every time he did so through cunning rather than strength. Karath doesn't buy it, but if Zamar's so concerned, he suggests that the Jedi Master take a fighter and join the squadrons pursuing the Mumo Willowa. He actually jokes that they won't accidentally shoot him out of the sky, which is hardly a comforting sentiment for Master Zamar at that moment. At any rate, the situation is looking pretty hopeless for our heroes, but then Jarael and Zane have a crazy idea. Ignoring Roland's objections, Jarael takes the helm and guides the Mumo Willowa towards the Swiftshore. Before the crew on board can activate the tractor beams, the cargo vessel crashes into the main hangar, blocking the doors. Eventually, Karath and his men manage to get inside. They find the ship, as well as Jarael and the Mumos and a sleeping LB, but no sign of Zane or Griff. What's more, Master Zamar seems to have gone missing as well. As Karth leads his fighter squadron back onto their normal patrol route, they notice a small cargo hauler departing the Swiftshore for the surface. The Deadweight. The other pilots assume it's just another cargo run, and Karth opts not to pursue. Slisk safely lands the Deadweight on Coruscant, but apparently the Trandoshan has suffered from a panic attack, and so Griff has sent him ahead to a hotel. As they prepare to bring the artifacts to their meeting with Masters Vandar and Vrook, it turns out that someone else was hiding aboard the Deadweight. Meanwhile, as Alec and Shell lead the two masters to the rendezvous point, Vrook Lamar remains skeptical that the evidence they have in hand might actually be enough to persuade the Council. A lot of people in the Order might simply defend Crinda Dre because she was their instructor. It's been established that after the Sith War, she was possibly the only seer experienced enough to teach Jedi Foresight to students. Who knows how many of those students are part of the Covenant? There's also the question of legacy and image. Crinda Dre is one of the few people left alive within the Order who remember the Sith War. She is an important symbol. Even with ironclad proof, the Council may not wish to denounce her for risk of tearing the Order apart. Finally, there's the fact that thanks to Admiral Karath, half the Republic thinks that Zane is a Mandalorian agent. The Dreys could simply denounce Zane's cache of Sith artifacts as having been supplied to him by the Mandalorians. Without the pictures from the recording devices back in Exalted, it would only be his word against theirs that the artifacts came from Odrin and a Covenant storehouse. Master Vandar grimly admits that what they need most is for someone within the Covenant itself to turn coat. Suddenly, from right behind them, a voice says, "Someone might." And the last image of Turnabout is Master Zamar holding a lightsaber to Griff and Zane's throat. "I have brought Zane Carrick and Marn Hierogriff to justice. The form it takes depends on what you say to me now." That's how Turnabout ends. Which does make it a little jarring pacing-wise that at the beginning of Vindication, we have Zane, Griff, and Zamar having already agreed on a plan and making their way towards the Dre estate, the headquarters of the Covenant. It's a ploy as old as Star Wars itself, the escort the prisoner gambit, with Zane wearing a black robe, yellow contact lenses in his eyes, and a replica of the Myrrh talisman. To the guards outside the Dre estate, it looks as if Zamar is bringing in, at last, the dread Zane Carrick and his Snivian accomplice. The guards ask Zamar if he might need any help with his two prisoners, and the master says no, but advises them to wait inside the walls regardless. Inside the walls, the Dre estate is practically crawling with Covenant members, a testament to the extent of Crinda Dre's influence within the Jedi Order. A massive clandestine faction within the Jedi Order, and until the Padawan massacre on Taris, no one outside of the Covenant even suspected its existence. What follows is one of many excellent moments in this climactic arc of the story, and it is brilliantly carried by Miller's dialogue. But art direction matters too, and it is significant that artist Brian Ching has Zamar deliver these lines while a statue of Master Vodo Siosk Bas, the Jedi murdered by his own fallen Sith apprentice Exar Kun, looms overhead. And here I thought you Jedi were all one big happy family. A myth hiding the truth, that we are mortal. We do not always know what to do. Crinda's teacher, Vodo, sensed an emptiness in his learner, Exar Kun, but failed to keep him from launching the Sith War. So now, a generation later, every Jedi has a cause. The Revankists watch the Mandalorians, we watch the Sith, and the High Council chooses neither, because differences do not serve its image of serenity. But they agree with me about one thing. Crinda's importance. It is why I confessed to them earlier today. I accept punishment in exchange for full immunity for her and a role in her rescue. My life for hers. After Zamar delivers his speech, we are essentially brought up to speed on what the plan is. Now alerted to the Covenant's existence by Zamar's confession, the Council is arranging a strike force to attack the Dre compound, where a large percentage of the Covenant's leadership is now gathered. Zamar's plan is to bring Zane and Griff inside and then demand that Crinda see the prisoners. Once the Covenant leader has been drawn out of her chambers, Zane and Griff are to create a diversion so that Zamar can safely escort Crinda out of the compound, at which point the Council forces will strike and arrest everyone inside. And if things go really pear-shaped, at least Zane's lightsaber is concealed inside the fake Myrrh talisman, so he and Griff won't be completely defenseless. Zane is doubtful that they'll be able to fool the rest of the Covenant into thinking he's a Sith for very long, but as Zamar points out, most of the Covenant already believes he is one. It's also revealed here that the reason Zamar has decided to turn against the Covenant is because he's finally realized that back when Lucian had said that they'd gotten the approval to kill the Padawans from their superiors, he was lying. This is actually a bit of a weak point in the writing, as we're not shown any indication previously that Zamar had figured this out. Maybe if they'd added like one extra panel showing this back in, say, Turnabout after Lucian lashed out at him in Canilia. Still, I do really love this scene because it lends so much character and sympathy to Zamar. Apart from Lucian, none of the 5 Jedi Masters have gotten a significant degree of characterization in this storyline. All we've really known about Zamar up to this point was that he was the most reluctant to kill the Padawans, but that he did go along with it once Lucian had assured them that their murder had sanction. And of course the fact that, like the other seers, he was haunted to some degree by the prophecy of his own impending death. Still, like pretty much every member of the Covenant, he firmly believed in the cause and the rightness of what they were doing. And that's what makes this scene so sad and beautiful, especially now that Zamar knows that Lucian lied to him and the others. The 5 Masters of the First Watch Circle have been together for a very long time. It's heavily implied that Feln was at least an adult by the time the Jedi found him, but in the case of Zamar, Canilia, Lucian, and Rana Tay, the flashback chapter shows that they've known each other at least since they were small children. They grew up together and trained together under Crinda's tutelage. They were comrades united by a common cause. They were friends and trusted one another. And now, Zamar knows that Lucian betrayed that trust. The murder of 4 students, Taris's loss of confidence in the Jedi, resulting in their withdrawal, which in turn resulted in the planet falling to the Mandalorians, Rana Tay and Canilia's mental deterioration, the deaths of Rana Tay and Feln, all of this, the consequence of Lucian Dre's lie. And that realization has led Zamar to a sad conclusion, that the Covenant is wrong. The mission to which he had trained his entire life to fulfill is wrong, because Jedi are just as fallible as any other being. And if that's the case, what right do they have to dictate who lives or dies in order to preserve the safety of the Republic and the Jedi Order? When Zane asks Zamar what he thinks of him, given the prophecy of the Rogue Moon, Zamar admits he is not fit to decide, but he's also no longer willing to let Lucian decide. Zamar brings his prisoners into the Covenant's inner sanctum, and among other things, we finally have a long-awaited encounter. We meet at last the accomplice. That's Mastermind. Of course, Lucian is all for killing Zane on the spot, but Zamar insists that Crinda see the boy first. Alas, as the great Helmuth von Moltke once declared, no plan survives first contact with the enemy. And when Hazen steps in, insisting that Crinda is in meditation and will not be disturbed, the plan is already in danger of unraveling. Lucian has no intention of letting Zane anywhere near Crinda because of the Rogue Moon prophecy, and at last we finally have a bit of an explanation. Why did Lucian disobey Crinda and Hazen's orders to bring the 5 Padawans to Coruscant after the Rogue Moon prophecy? Why did he lie to the other Taris Masters to convince them to kill their Padawans? Remember in Canilia's part of the vision, she dies alone and despairing amidst the ruins of the temple and so many dead Jedi, desperately trying to protect her, but it's already too late. She is already dead. Who could this person be? Well, who have the First Watch Circle been trying to see since the Flashpoint arc? It can only be Crinda Dre. And that is why Lucian did what he did. Because the prophecy suggested that one of their Padawans would kill his mother. And even though his mother has always neglected him, barely acknowledged him at all because of his lack of foresight, Lucian will do anything to protect Crinda Dre. Because Lucian, at the end of the day, beyond all else, is a man with mommy issues. Realizing that their plan is in danger of falling apart completely, Zane whispers that Zamar should go outside and let the Council Jedi in. If the fighting breaks out, he promises to personally protect Crinda. And I do like this little touch here. When Zamar asks why he would want to do that after all the Covenant's done to him, Zane simply says that I promised someone I would. Clearly, his failure to help Celeste and her death still weighs on him. Zane distracts everybody by really hamming up his fall to the dark side act. And between all his threats and snarls, he deliberately reveals the existence of the cache of Sith artifacts stored aboard the Deadweight. This gives Zamar the excuse to go to the entrance of the estate under the pretense of going to retrieve those artifacts, while Hazen sends two of the other Covenant acolytes to retrieve a case of what he calls diagnostic equipment. Unfortunately, Zane's altered version of the plan begins to fall apart just as quickly as the original. Hazen gets close enough to seize the fake Myrrh talisman containing Zane's lightsaber and reveals that he knew all along that this was a ruse, and that Zane, whatever else he is no Sith. Meanwhile, Zamar reaches the gates of the Dre estate and opens them, allowing the Council forces to launch their attack. By the way, there's this darkly hilarious bit here where there's some kind of drone or droid saying that this compound is under investigation by the Jedi Council. Apparently in the late 3000s BBY, investigation meant heavily armed military assault. Don't you just love euphemisms? And yet, Hazen isn't fazed in the slightest. Instead, he starts giving orders via comlink. It turns out that right after Lucian became a member of the High Council, he and Hazen had worked out a little scheme that would allow them to place members of the Covenant in key positions throughout the Order. Now, at Hazen's command, the agents spring into action, securing any and all storehouses of Jedi and Sith artifacts and severing the High Council's communication with the rest of the Republic. Still others begin converging on the Dre estate to defend it. And how does he justify this, you ask? By declaring that the prophesied return of the Sith has happened within the High Council, and that now the Covenant, the true loyal Jedi, must save the Order from itself. This was the plan cooked up by him and Lucian. The difference was, Lucian actually thought that this would be used only against a genuine Sith threat, but it's pretty clear now that Hazen arranged all of this just so that he can launch a coup d'etat against the High Council and, in the name of the Covenant and Crinda Dre, take over the entire Order for himself. At the realization of his former mentor's betrayal, for the first time ever in this series, the stern and resolute Lucian Dre actually collapses as it finally dawns on him that he and everyone else in the Covenant have been played like a fiddle. Hazen used them all and made them dance like puppets to his tune. So focused was the Covenant on looking outwards for the Sith threat, it never occurred to them that the threat might be within all along. I've said throughout this series that Miller does great dialogue in KOTOR the comic. But as far back as Knight Errant, I've maintained that what Miller is truly best at is a good villainous monologue, and oh, how I have waited for this moment, as Hazen takes the metaphorical mask off and gloats over his victory. Lucian protests that he never wanted any of this, and Hazen responds, "Of course you did. I've always given you what you wanted, and what you didn't want, I made you want. Knighthood, the Covenant, the High Council, even Cornelia, though that was more amusing than anything else, the unwanted son and the hated fanatic who replaced him. A perfectly entertaining couple. Add our new guests and the group is complete. A fitting audience, don't you agree?" Even the fact that the Covenant is currently under attack right now doesn't faze him, as he presses a button on an obviously evil-looking gauntlet, and just like that, the slave circuitry controlling Admiral Karath's fleet turns about and begins firing just outside the compound, killing almost everyone outside, including Zaymar. As the dust settles and everyone else claws their way out of the rubble, it turns out that box of diagnostic equipment was actually a box of Sith artifacts, and now, fully mask off, practically dripping in Sith weaponry and artifacts, Hazen, the true big bad of the story, stands revealed. A bit contrived, you say? Sure, maybe a few sinister hints previously, but out of left field, you say? Fear not, for Miller is a better writer than that. Backstory time. Between 30 and 40 standard years ago, shortly before the beginning of the Sith War, Hazen was himself a young Jedi in training, and apparently, much like our young hero Zane, he wasn't very good at being a Jedi. Just as Zane continuously tried and failed to capture Griff, Hazen continuously tried and failed to arrest a smuggler on Arcania named Dosa. More often than not, his attempts would get him into serious trouble and require his bacon to be hauled from the fire by his friend and fellow student, Barrison Dre. Both young men were of similar age and had known each other for years. In fact, Hazen's family had long served the Dreys as servants and retainers for generations. But class distinctions have never mattered to the Jedi, and since both of them showed some ability with the Force, they had been brought in for training. Barrison was in many ways everything that Hazen wasn't. He was strong in the Force, he was capable, and he was rich, although once he became a full Jedi Knight, he was going to leave all that behind. Problem was, as the only heir to the Dre family business, his becoming a knight would leave most of his family's employees without a job. But Barrison was never one to let such things stop him. He got around this by converting his family business into the Dre Trust, an arrangement that he made with Zerka Arms and Adas Corp. This way, all those people would keep their jobs and the business would still continue to make money, although now most of that money was going to go to charitable causes, leaving behind a small percentage that would be used to support any of Barrison's descendants who turned out to be non-Force sensitive. Yep, Barrison pretty much had everything Hazen wanted and didn't have, including the affections of their fellow student, Krinda. Despite their long association and friendship, there had always been a part of Hazen that envied and resented Barrison. Alas, that all came to a head on the day when it was decided by their instructor, Arca Jeth, that Barrison and Krinda would both advance to the rank of Jedi Knight, but not Hazen. Master Arca told him that he lacked talent, he lacked discipline, he lacked self-control over his emotions. He'd always orbited around the achievements of Barrison and Krinda, but had never really contributed himself. He was, sadly but manifestly, unqualified. But Hazen couldn't accept it. Jedi knighthood. One more thing that Barrison got and he was denied. Furious at his rejection, Hazen stormed off, and when Barrison followed and tried to console him, he lashed out instead, accusing Barrison of essentially buying everything he had in life, including knighthood and Krinda's love. Barrison gave him a good smack in the face for that, but instantly regretted his actions. Barrison would not go against the Jedi Order's verdict, but he did promise that he would do what he could to make sure that Hazen still had a place in the Order, that he could still serve the Jedi in some capacity. Barrison meant well, but it was exactly the kind of charity that could only serve to remind Hazen every day that he was Barrison's inferior, his servant. A few years passed. Barrison and Krinda married and were soon expecting their first child. Then the Sith War began, and while Barrison fought on the front lines as a Jedi Knight of distinction, Hazen served as his assistant, often doing such admittedly thankless tasks as sorting out the bodies of the Jedi dead from their enemies. If you want to know the main events of the Sith War, either read the Tales of the Jedi comic or refer to my videos on the subject. Anyway, at some point late in the war, presumably as Exar Kun was withdrawing to Yavin 4 for the final reckoning, Barrison had helped win another battle on Taprawa, and Hazen was sifting through yet another pile of corpses when he encountered Dosa again, this time in the pay of Exar Kun. At this point, it was clear that the Sith were on the losing end of the war, which of course meant Dossa wasn't going to get paid anytime soon. Still, even if the Sith were losing the war, Dossa had a plan of her own, and she knew that Hazen would be a very useful component in that plan. And since she knew Hazen pretty well, given all his futile attempts to apprehend her in the past when he was an apprentice, she knew all the right buttons to push. "I've been watching, love. He got his money, his lightsaber, his woman, and his clumsy little droid, Hazen. All you need is a restraining bolt. Exar Kun's pulling back, maybe to Yavin. We are all going soon enough, but everybody doesn't have to lose. There's a way for you to return as the victorious hero, and just you. Don't lie to Dossa. Tell me what you really want." And what did Hazen want? Barristan Drey's life. His life and everything in it. And so the plan was set. Hazen went back to Barristan and told him that he saw Dossa go down into some nearby caverns. Given her new employers, it was possible that one of the last Sith bases left on Toprawa was down there. Hazen then led Barristan and the other Jedi down into the cave, only for Dossa to set off some nearby explosives, killing the Jedi instantly. Except, Dossa blew the charges before Hazen could get clear, deliberately. When Hazen finally awoke, he was practically unrecognizable. He'd been so crippled by the explosion that one of his arms and both of his legs had had to be replaced with prosthetics. What's more, Dossa and her friend, a certain Dr. Uberla, had grafted multiple Sith artifacts into his own flesh. One of these, the Yoke of Seeming, a device that would hide Hazen and his intentions from the perceptions of other Jedi. He would never figure in any vision of the future they happened to see, and his own secret desires would remain hidden from their thoughts. Her service to the Sith had given Dossa a keen interest in acquiring Sith artifacts, and this was why she had set Hazen up. With her knowledge of his betrayal, there was no way he could go back to the Jedi. To her mind, he would have no choice but to be her willing tool. Unfortunately, Dossa underestimated Hazen. Instead, he killed both her and the Doctor and decided to co-opt her plan as his own. He would seek Sith artifacts to strengthen his own power. And so, he returned to the Republic and the Jedi Order. He reconnected with Krinda and began setting his plans in motion. Taking advantage of Krinda's grief over the death of her husband and her own self-loathing for failing to predict the Sith War, it was Hazen who manipulated Krinda into creating the Covenant and using Barristan's trust to fund its activities. Of course, he sold it to her as the idea of keeping an eye out for the return of the Sith, and finding and removing any Sith artifacts that could possibly be used in such a scheme. In reality, the whole purpose of the Covenant was just to gather up Sith artifacts that Hazen intended to use for himself. And Lucien, the son whom Krinda neglected because he lacked her second sight? From the very beginning, Hazen saw how desperately Lucien wanted his mother's approval and recognition. And so he played upon those desires, convincing Lucien that the only way to win his mother's approval was to serve her goal. The Covenant's goal. In reality, his goal. How it must have tickled Hazen pink to turn the son of his former master into his servant, his pawn, his dupe. And with the Yoke of Seeming hiding his thoughts and concealing his plans from the currents of the future, no one ever suspected him. No one suspected the failed Padawan with barely an inkling of Force talent. The last part of the flashback skips ahead to right around the time that Lucien and the First Watch Circle were first assigned students and sent to Taris. While delivering a routine report on the Covenant's activities one evening to Krinda, Hazen reveals that the main reason the First Watch Circle was on Taris in the first place was to find the Myrrh Talisman. He also reveals that one of the other Watch Circles has uncovered a recent technological development, the Vangervalis chain. Naturally, the Covenant now possesses a copy of the designs for that system. For decades, Hazen has played the Spider, sitting at the center of a vast secret web, Krinda, obsessed with peering into the future and with training new Jedi Seers, pretty much delegated all other responsibilities pertaining to the Covenant and its running to him, meaning that he has been the de facto leader of the Covenant from its very inception, even as everyone else, including Krinda, believed that she was in charge. And now, at last, the time has come to strike. When all is said and done, Hazen is not a complex villain. He falls more into the category of the charismatic, enjoyably evil big bad. But because Miller uses his backstory to draw a comparison between him and Zane, there is an aspect of his concept that is genuinely fascinating. And I'm sorry that I have to grind the video to a halt to go into this, but I think this is worth talking about. Because Hazen's backstory is essentially a deliberate inversion of a trope that we're very familiar with, the dynamic of the rich bad guy and the poor good guy. Even in the modern sense, this trope is an old one, going all the way back to Pierre Beaumarchais and the most famous play in the French language, The Marriage of Figaro. The play is mostly famous outside of the French-speaking world for the speech its titular hero delivers in the fifth and final act. Figaro, a poor servant, denounces both his antagonist, the Count Almaviva, and the entire notion of inherited privilege. Literally revolutionary, given that this was a play released 3 years before the French Revolution. The idea of those with higher socioeconomic status who don't deserve what they have was taken up by the Marxists in their famous dichotomy of the proletariat and the bourgeoisie. And it makes sense why this dichotomy of the evil rich guy and the virtuous poor guy is so commonplace and so popular in storytelling. We like our heroes to succeed, and we like it even more when they succeed against great odds. It's the classic underdog formula, and making the bad guy rich with all the resource and social advantages that implies makes for a good obstacle. And this is what makes Hazen's backstory so fascinating to me on a conceptual level, because it's a kind of antagonist we almost never see in fiction. In any other story, Hazen would be the hero and Barrison would be the bad guy. The poor hero wrongly dismissed by others, and the rich villain resting on the achievements and wealth accrued by his ancestors, not himself. But that's not the dynamic here. We're never given anything that suggests that Barrison was anything other than a genuinely decent man, and it's clear that his natural talent with the Force is superior to Hazen's. Now, it's not Hazen's fault that his abilities are lacking, but neither is it anyone else's fault. And as Master Arca pointed out in the flashback, it seems that Hazen made no effort to make up for his shortcomings. Barrison was rich before he created the Dre Trust, but he was also a genuinely noble and talented Jedi Knight, while Hazen, poor, weak, and talentless, conspired to have him murdered out of jealousy and spite. Now, was this all a deliberate plan on Miller's part? Maybe. I think he is talented enough. But I think that it's more likely that he just set up this backstory to draw a direct comparison and a contrast between his hero and his villain. Zane was also written off as someone lacking in ability. And while there have been hints that he may just have a very unconventional connection to the Force, that has yet to be elucidated in the story. Also like Hazen, Zane was surrounded by peers who were clearly superior in ability to himself. And yet there was never any indication that Zane resented or was jealous of the other Padawans in the way that Hazen was toward Barrison. Sure, he was always pretty bummed about the idea that his likelihood of becoming a knight was practically nil. And, lest we forget, ever since the Padawan massacre has been persecuted to a degree that Hazen never was. Apart from that brief confrontation with Jarail back in commencement, Zane never really wallowed in self-pity about his fate. And despite his lack of ability, was even willing to go out on a limb more than once to help others, even people who very much wanted him dead. Zane's quest throughout this story has been to prove that he isn't something that others say he is, a murderer. And yet he has admitted to others and himself on multiple times that, in a way, he is a failure as a Jedi. He accepts who he is and the galaxy for what it is, warts and all. By contrast, Hazen never seemed to move beyond the preconception of the cosmic injustice of a universe that seemed to deny him everything he wanted and gave it to someone else. Sorry for the long tangent. Back to the story. Back in the present, Hazen continues to gloat about just how well his plan is going. right down to the fact that when the Covenant first discovered the development of the Vangervalis slave circuit system, he not only used the Dre Trust to buy a controlling interest in that company, but even managed to successfully slip in a little extra design feature, a direct link to himself, which is how he is able to control the Swift Shore and by extension, the fleet in orbit. He knows that this control is only temporary. In fact, at that exact moment, Karath and his bridge crew realize that the best way to stop the fleet is to destroy the Swift Shore itself. Hazen is confident that it will last long enough to suit his purposes. Zane, Lucien, or some of the others might try to stop him right here, but Hazen, though he was never very strong in the Force, has managed to get around this by grafting all manner of Sith artifacts to his body. Notably, the Gauntlet of Kresh the Younger, which essentially produces the ultimate area of denial effect. As long as he's wearing it, no one can so much as touch him without his consent. Those who try will get thrown back by a particularly painful force field. He then proceeds to ramble on about Krinda's Prophecy of Five, and how he now thinks he knows what the prophecy refers to, or should I say, who it refers to. He thinks that Zane and Lucien represent the one for the light and the one for the dark, respectively. Cornelia is the one from the light who stands in darkness, which fits given her blind fanaticism, while Griff is the one from the darkness who stands in the light, as he is a criminal but is trying to help the good guy, Zane. Where his interpretation gets a little shaky is the part where he claims to be the one that stands apart from all. He aspires to rule both Jedi and Sith, but claims to be neither. But let's be honest, folks. If the man looks like a Sith and cackles like a Sith, the smart money says he's a Sith. The man outright suggests that Lucien be the one to train the Sith of the future. He even suggests that the man might go by the name Darth Sion, a reference to one of the antagonists from KOTOR 2, the Sith Lords, suggesting that Lucien might be Darth Sion and that Krinda might be Kreia. But as we'll soon see, neither is true. The byplay is interrupted by Cornelia waking up and then rushing off to find Krinda. Zane and Griff try to go after her, but Lucien stops Zane from going, because again, the prophecy of the Rogue Moon has him convinced that Zane will cause his mother's death, and with Lucien Dre, mommy issues trump everything else, even the fact that Hazen is obviously trying to manipulate him the same way that Palpatine tried to manipulate Luke in Return of the Jedi. Griff follows Cornelia into Krinda's bedchambers, only to find the Covenant Jedi weeping beside what appears to be a casket. Krinda Dre hasn't been meditating in seclusion all this time. Apparently, she's dead. And Cornelia, fanatically devoted to Krinda as she's been her entire life, has taken poison in preparation to join her. But of course, drama takes precedence over everything in storytelling, and so the poison is just slow-acting enough so that the Miraluka and the Snivian can have one final confrontation. Verbal confrontation, that is. A verbal confrontation about prophecy and how people interpret them, and how they become over-reliant on them. Cornelia insists that this is exactly as the Rogue Moon prophecy foretold. All 4 seers are dead because of Zane. Griff then points out that if anything, he had more to do with killing off the Covenant members than Zane did. After all, he was the one who blew up the building under Ranate and the one who swapped out Feln's lightsaber for the crooked stick on Audran. Zamar's death was more to do with Hazen's scheming than anyone else's. Cornelia brings up the issue of the red suit that Zane wore. Griff retorts that a lot of people have worn that suit since. Jarail, Alec, even himself. Apparently back in commencement he tried to use it as a sleeping space, but the suit was too big. That's the problem with you people and your prophecies. When something doesn't fit, you force it. Cornelia retorts that even if that's the case, what of Zane's prophecy? The one who confesses lives. Well, Zamar confessed, and now he's dead. At which point, Griff reveals that he was the one who came up with Zane's speech and his prophecy at the end of commencement. It was all a ploy to make the Covenant hesitant in chasing them down, thus giving him and Zane more time to try and clear their names. Cornelia simply can't believe this. Zane had promised to hunt them all down himself. At which point, our favorite mastermind responds with the winning retort. Anybody who really knew Zane would never have bought that. If you did, after all those years, I guess you never really knew him at all. Nice play, Griff. At which point Cornelia finally succumbs, dying in despair and darkness, thus fulfilling the prophecy of the rogue moon. In her case particularly, a self-fulfilled prophecy. Right after she's dead, Griff realizes that what Krinda is lying in isn't a casket, but an oubliette, just like the one on Jebel that Celeste Morn was sealed inside. Just like Drapa's oubliette, this one completely cut Krinda off from the Force, meaning that Cornelia, a Miraluka, could not sense her, and of course, since Cornelia didn't have eyes, she could never have seen this for herself. Back downstairs, Lucien is still busily trying to kill his former student. Zane keeps trying to reason with the man, saying that maybe they should try to work together and stop Hazen, maybe save Krinda from him. But the mommy issue blinders are in full effect, until Griff staggers back down the stairs, half carrying Krinda. Remember how way back when Lucien first reported the Rogue Moon prophecy to his mother and Hazen, both had ordered him to bring the students to Coruscant? Well, as if Lucien's day couldn't already get worse, his mother reveals that that very night she had a vision of him and the others of the Watch Circle killing their students, in spite of hers and Hazen's instructions. She tried to send a message to him, but suffered a massive stroke. She would have died on the spot, except Hazen had sealed her inside the oubliette. And because the oubliette was a Sith artifact just like the one on Jebel, it seems that it kept her alive only so that her mind could relive the vision of her son and his friends murdering their Padawans for however many months she was stuck in there. The only thing that allowed her to retain her sanity was the conviction that her son was not a murderer, that he would never do what she'd seen in the vision. Of course, you can imagine how well she responds when Lucien is forced to admit that while he didn't kill the Padawans himself, he did order their murders. Krinda asks her son whatever gave him the idea that the Covenant's mission was worth sacrificing the lives of children, to which Lucien can only reply, "You did." Children come in. We send them against the Sith. They devote. We sacrifice their lives to your mission. It's what you wanted, Mother. It's what I thought. It's what you wanted. Krinda dies immediately afterwards, though she does at least admit that she was wrong before she succumbs to her stroke. And I have to admit, the more I think about this scene, the more of a beef I seem to have with it. For my money, Krinda dies just a little too quickly, and the story seems to let her off a little too easily. I think there should have been at least one more page stewing on the fact that this is all because Krinda neglected her own son. All that had ever mattered to Krinda Dre following the Sith War was looking into the future and trying to prevent a repeat performance. All that mattered to her was the cause, and once it was clear that Lucien had no foresight and thus could not help the cause as she saw it, she immediately wrote him off as useless, worthless even, which of course left him as a little boy wide open to Hazen's manipulations. Because Krinda neglected him, Hazen was able to convince Lucien that the only way that he could ever win his mother's approval was to devote himself body and soul to her cause. And in fairness to Hazen, I don't think he was lying. Plus, if Hazen's earlier statement is to be believed, because of Krinda's neglect, Hazen was able to manipulate Lucien into a toxic relationship with Cornelia, the first person to replace him in his mother's regard, purely for his own sick amusement. I don't think that's emphasized enough in Krinda's final moments for my liking. Real Mother of the Year, this lady. Of course, Krinda dies in her son's arms, and the instant Lucien realizes that it was Griff's removing her from the stasis pod that killed her, Zane immediately tells his friend to run, because a lifetime of mommy issues has now hit critical mass. And so, we come to it, a final climactic duel between former master and former apprentice. As Miller had planned from the very beginning, a direct inversion of the climax of Revenge of the Sith. Instead of a master betrayed by his student, it's the student betrayed by the master. Even now, though, Zane continues to plead with his master to see reason. It's obvious to anyone with the eyes to see it that this is what Hazen wants, for Lucien to kill Zane and Griff in his vengeful anger, and then take his place as the Sith apprentice. At this point, though, Lucien's anger has given way to a kind of despair, as he believes that he can no longer escape whatever fate Hazen has in store for him. At which point, Miller again kills it with the dialogue by giving Zane his own brief speech. Fine, go ahead, kill Griff, kill me, kill everybody, become Darth whatever, be someone else's pawn. You've done it all your life, it's what you're best at. While all this is going on, Hazen is just casually preparing for the next phase of his plan. He's just killed the Covenant agents he sent to retrieve a bunch of Sith artifacts from the Jedi Temple itself, and is now preparing to send the final command to his slaved fleet to blow up the Jedi Temple and thus decapitate the Order's leadership. His villainous musings are interrupted by a terrified Griff who runs out into the garden of the estate, pursued by Lucien, who is in turn pursued by Zane. Master and apprentice cross sabers yet again, and once again, luck or the Force is with the Padawan, as their combat causes a statue of Barriss Dre to fall on top of Lucien, and Zane uses the opening to drive his saber home. Hazen was not expecting this particular outcome, but that's fine. He can accommodate Zane Carrick as his pawn. Assured of his inevitable triumph, he allows Zane to approach him. And thus he makes the classic mistake of many a villain, Sith or otherwise.
Your overconfidence is your weakness.
Zane, under the pretense of having a vision, suddenly seizes the Gauntlet of Kresh the Younger and strikes it off with his lightsaber. He then throws the gauntlet to a still very much alive Lucien and seizes Griff just in time for his former master to force throw the pair of them clear of the Dre estate. For the first and only time, master and apprentice have worked together to bring down a common enemy. Once Zane and Griff are safely out of harm's way, Lucien uses the command protocol that was attached to the Gauntlet of Kresh the Younger to direct the Republic fleet still slaved to it to fire upon himself and Hazen, obliterating the Dre estate. Apparently there was some debate over whether or not to include sound effects in this particular panel. Personally, I think leaving them out was very much to its advantage. Zane and Griff do manage to find a safe landing, but Zane's luck, or his relationship to the Force being what it is, naturally that soft landing turns out to be a sludge pit. Zane sums up his situation quite succinctly as he hauls himself and the Snivian free. The Force does not want me dead. It does not want me happy, but it does not want me dead. For his part, Griff is too busy being offended by the realization that Zane and Lucien had tricked him. He wasn't in on their plan to fool Hazen, and so when Lucien had chased him out into the garden, he'd actually thought the Jedi was really trying to kill him. Days later, it's revealed that the Jedi and the Republic have decided to bury the truth of what happened, and instead frame the incident as a Mandalorian terrorist attack, mostly to save face. As Griff puts it, Republic, Jedi, they're all embarrassed. Hazen ran the long con like a pro. The cover-up has to be just as good. So while they've cleared us of the murders, only the Padawans' families are being told what really happened. And the Jedi paid off the bounties on us. Even paid the Mumos for officially bringing us in. That should do wonders for their reps. But it's not all sunshine and politically convenient cover-ups. The High Council still clings to its posture of neutrality with regards to the Mandalorian Wars, and if anything, the exposure of the Covenant has only increased its mistrust of the Revanchists, another schismatic faction within the ranks of the Jedi. Now that his name's been cleared, Zane is actually not only offered to return to the ranks of the Jedi, but even receive knighthood, something that previously he could only have dreamed of. But he turns it down. The Jedi didn't help him when he needed it. Griff and Jerael had. Granted, neither had been enthusiastic about it originally, but that's beside the point. After seeing what Jedi can get up to when they focus on the big picture at the expense of the little people, young Zane has decided he would rather work with Griff, on two conditions. One, he gets a vacation. After all the crap he's been through, he's earned it. And two, a promotion from henchman to partner. Look out, universe, it's Carrick and Griff. With their powers combined, they'll either rule the galaxy or destroy it and sell it for scrap. But it turns out the apprentice isn't the only one with a fresh start. Thanks to the protective field provided by the Gauntlet of Kresh the Younger, Lucien Dre survived the final bombardment of the estate, although not without serious injury, including the loss of his eyes. and it's only appropriate that Miller conclude Vindication by giving one final speech to him. Hazen got what he wanted. I saw into the dark side. I drowned in fire, and while holding the Kresh gauntlet spared my body, mostly, nothing could protect my soul. Betrayal and fury suffocated me and sustained me. I saw a river leading to a dark world, where I might embrace my destiny as a lord of pain. I swam towards it, but then I thought of my father. I barely knew him, but I knew he never accepted any role others had in mind for him. They said a captain of industry could never become a Jedi. He found a way. They said as a Jedi he couldn't look out for the millions he once employed. He found a way. And I remembered that I too had another way, because there was something I hadn't told Hazen. I never spoke of the money I diverted long ago to buy this moon, a private sanctum, a redoubt, where, if necessary, I might reconstitute a true covenant, not just along my mother's beliefs, but embracing my father's as well. If we cannot change what others will do in the future, we can change what we do. We can choose a different role. We cannot avert the prophesied doom, but we can survive it. And we will survive. We are few, but the Jedi ways will go on after the tribulations come. I know this because I am the son of Krinda and Barrisan Dre, and at last I can see my future. Even when you take into account the awkward way in which Miller spliced the Vector crossover event into the storyline, I still say that this makes for an excellent climax and a great conclusion to the first major story arc of the series. The vast majority of the setups have been paid off. The quality of the art has varied over the course of this series, as is inevitable when you have multiple different artists, but at least the overwhelming majority of the art thus far was done by the two best artists, Brian Ching and Dustin Weaver. And while I think there should have been a little more emphasis on Krinda's own culpability in the creation of the Covenant and by extension its wrongdoings, in every other respect, this climax in particular is exactly what I would want. Some might think Lucien's ultimate fate is a little undeserved, but in fairness, it's not as though he's getting off scot-free, having suffered serious injuries and now essentially living in a self-imposed exile. Even so, personally, I consider the conclusion of his arc satisfying for two reasons. First, it actually does make sense by the internal logic of the universe, specifically the Jedi Order. If you look at a history of the Jedi Order, you will find that there are multiple precedents of the Order, both before and after the Imperial era, offering second chances, even those who have committed far worse crimes than those of Lucien Dre. Two, it's in keeping with the themes of Star Wars. As established by Vader's redemption at the conclusion of Return of the Jedi, there is always the chance to reject the darkness and embrace the light. One only needs to have the will to reach for it. Whether or not you can atone for your previous sins or earn forgiveness for them is a different question entirely. As it stands, if Vindication marked the conclusion of the series, I would give this a canon verdict on the spot, even with some of the loose threads still left hanging. Luckily, there are still several issues left to go, and Miller is not the kind of writer who likes to leave loose ends, at least when he's not being interrupted by events beyond his control like Disney buying out Lucasfilm. But before those final few mysteries can be resolved, our heroes could use a break from all the excitement. Of course, in an adventure-packed galaxy far, far away, break from excitement has a very elastic definition. Next up, profit motive and faithful execution. Until then,